Thank you all for having me. I'm Brett, and I also want to thank Alfredo for inviting me today. So I'm here to speak a bit about a bio-based future where we don't have to use animals as factories for food and materials. I come from the world of alternative protein, which means using plant-based, fermentation-based, and cultivated technologies to make sure that animals don't have to be used for meat or leather or other materials. So I want to highlight these different areas and the technologies and the challenges that are out there. So I first entered the space by writing this book called Gentrepreneur. So it's all about how biotech is impacting climate. I interviewed some really exciting founders in the space. Next slide, please. And I want to explain what a gentrepreneur is because it's a word I made up. So basically, it's those who are using biotechnology in a way to impact climate, meaning animals, humans, and the planet. And so you don't have to necessarily be a scientist in the lab. You can work in finance, you can work in media, but it's about empowering the use of biotechnology to impact these areas. Next, please. So the problem right now is the operating system for food and materials is severely outdated. We've been utilizing factory farming for decades to squeeze every little inch of efficiency out of cows, pigs, fish, but we're reaching this glass ceiling. And it's because if you think about a cow, it has to maintain its life support systems. It has to maintain body heat, it has to breathe, it moves around. So all the calories that you're putting in, many of them go out to support the life system. You put 40 calories into a cow and you get 1 calorie out, so I'd say it's not a very good factory. And so we actually are leveraging plant-based technology, fermentation-based technology, and cultivated meat technology to make sure that we can rise above this glass ceiling that animals are now at. And the meat industry is huge. I mean, we're talking not just the muscle tissue, but also fat. So here in London, we have a company called Hoxton Farms, which is actually cultivating animal fat to put into plant-based burgers. Plant-based fats run out. They have a very low melting temperature. But if you put in animal fats, there's some magic that happens, which makes it really tasty. If you have seafood, I've never met as many pescatarians as I have since moving to the UK. And then dairy, eggs, and byproducts. So this could be things like collagen used in cosmetics. Collagen is also used in gummies. So we're talking about lots of different animal byproducts. Next slide, please. So a lot of us have tried Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods. They use 5% of the land, a quarter of the water, and only emit 12% of the greenhouse gas emissions that you would from animal agriculture. But there's some other companies that also you may not have heard of yet, one of which I interviewed in my book. Next slide, please. This one is called Wild Earth. So in the US, we love pets. There's 330 million people and about half as many cats and dogs. And 25% of greenhouse gas emissions coming from animal agriculture come from the pet food industry. And oftentimes, it's the bad parts of the meat. It's from animals that are already dead, dying, diseased, or disabled. And so Ryan here has challenged a bunch of pet food CEOs to try their own product, and none of them will. But he's always his first customer and the taste tester. So he's actually created koji-based pet food. So koji is a type of filamentous fungus that grows on rice. It's very popular in Asia. And he went on Shark Tank, and he actually landed a deal with Mark Cuban for over $500,000. And now they've spread not only into the US, but also into India. So this is on the plant-based side. Now on the fermentation side, next slide, please. Sorry, this is my dog. I bought her a pack. She stuck her head right in there. I've also eaten some. It's human grade, pretty tasty. The next slide, please. So I worked at this company called Archeon, and they're a really special type of fermentation company. So here in London, we have one that is taking the genes that cows use to make milk. So the main proteins of milk are casein and whey. And if you put the biological encoding into a microbe, you can use the microbe as a factory to produce milk. So basically, you have a brewery, but instead of beer, it's dairy. Archeon is a bit different. So there's basically a way to capture protein from air. And there's a type of microbe that lives deep in the ocean. And when the ocean vents erupt and all this nutrients is released, they have to be very, very quick. And they scoop up all the nutrients, and they live in a symbiotic system. And this one very special type of archaea actually releases amino acids. And this is special because it's the building block of proteins. It's a very valuable piece of nutrient. So they've actually isolated, and they're able to convert CO2 into protein, into amino acids, which are building blocks of proteins. And they've just raised $7 million for their seed round, and they're based in Austria. So I got to go into the lab and basically have all these bubbling bioreactors, and they're different colors, and it's actually these extremophile archaea creating protein. Next slide, please. And this can be leveraged into things like plant-based foods, sports nutrition, condiments, and it's special because it's extremely soluble. So if you had a beverage, you could load it with protein and it'd all be in there. It also affects the texture. So one of the problems with plant-based meat at the moment is the texturization. Small changes upstream can affect the downstream product quite heavily. So if you have something that's very consistent and packed with protein, it's very valuable for companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond and many, many others. Next slide, please. So I want to pay attention to this one here. So by using gas fermentation, we can actually do a 20 times more efficient process than animal agriculture and photosynthesis. It's 200 times more efficient than meat. It's a small fraction of the water used because you can actually recycle it. And it's 99% less land. And the special part, too, is when you're actually eating product made of it, you're consuming carbon. You're eating climate change. So it's a third of a kilogram of CO2 consumed by the process for every kilogram of protein made, which is pretty special. Protein from air. Next slide, please. I just made this little thing. It's like Pac-Man, eat climate change. So another company, Alt Protein is not just in the food side. We're now starting to follow in the footsteps with biomaterials. And one of the companies I interviewed for my book, Dr. Molly Morse of Stanford, she takes an approach where she's isolated a microbe, has put them into waste treatment facilities, and they actually sequester the methane from the air and pack it into polymers underneath the microbial cell wall. And then they're able to crack open the microbe and put it into things like packaging or even to apparel. And when these things reach the end of their life cycle, they go back into a waste treatment facility and the cycle can start all over again. It's pretty cool. Next slide. So the last pillar of alternative protein I want to speak about is cultivated. So over almost 100 years ago, Winston Churchill came up with this quote in a speech where it's really absurd that we're growing all these chickens just for a breast or just for a wing. And like I said, you have to maintain their life support. So wouldn't it be great if we could just grow those things without the chicken? And this is what cultivated is doing. So I really hate this because we used to get a lot of media and people would just pick up some ground mincemeat and stick it in a petri dish, or they'd Photoshop it and they'd say it's lab-grown meat, but that's not what it is at all. That's just the experimentation that happens. Again, you can think of it like brewing, where you have big fermentation tanks and you're actually stimulating the cells to multiply and then differentiate into muscle. Next slide, please. This happened in 2013. It cost $330,000 for the first beef burger. And now, almost 10 years later, we're reaching a point where both Singapore and Israel are offering cultivated meat. The Netherlands is offering tastings, and hopefully within the next 5 to 10 years, we'll actually be able to try some more commercially. And like I said, you basically can take a cow, a pig, a chicken, a fish. There's different protocols for each. You take a sample, and then you put it into a nutrient-rich media. And you put it into essentially a big a bioreactor, we call them, a fermentation tank. And you can stimulate them to multiply, followed by differentiation. So you can make them fat, you can make them muscle, you can make them connective tissue. And then you can combine them in order to get a really nice beef burger or a pork sausage or a slice of sashimi. And this is one company I interviewed for my book. They're called Finless Foods. So whereas a lot of other fish we can actually do with aquaculture, bluefin tuna don't work that way. Someone in Japan tried, and all the fish went blind, and it's no good. So we have to catch wild-caught bluefin. And we've actually decimated their populations. There's only 4% left of their previous population. And they're also full of mercury and microplastics because we have a big microplastic problem. They eat lots of smaller fish, and thus they're a big accumulation point for all of the pollution. But there is an advantage to culturing them, actually. As opposed to mammals, which have high body temperatures, we can actually cultivate these at temperature of the ocean, and also their cells multiply quicker. So there's some advantages to actually culturing seafood. On the next slide, I interviewed New Age Meats. It's just highlighting that there was a bluefin tuna sold for $3.1 million in Japan, which is pretty big. And if we're moving from bluefin tuna to mahi-mahi or swordfish, it's actually quite simple. The recipe for the cells doesn't change too much across similar species. On the next slide, I interviewed New Age Meats, which is actually doing pork. And one of the advantages to doing a pork product is a lot of them are processed. You can think of a sausage or pepperoni as opposed to a steak, which is structured. So, next slide, sorry. So New Age Meats has just raised $25 million for their Series A. They're scaling up. And the vision would be to have a brewery, and right next to where your beer is brewed, you'd have your pork being cultured, and maybe you can have like a nice bread, a sourdough being cultivated as well. Next slide, please. And I just want to highlight, too, here in the UK, we're seeing a lot of enablers. So it's great to have the companies actually creating the product, but we need the bioreactors. So we need the unicorn biotechs of the world. We need the cell media that's providing all the nutrients. And we need ones who are actually creating new processes. So whereas beer is done in batches, if we can actually cultivate cells in a continuous process and just take off what we need, that's the next step of cellular agriculture. It's a pretty big market size. We've seen about $1 million in funding between 2015 and 2020 go into cultivated. And in 2021 to 2022, we reached that $1 billion plus just in that 1 year. And as far as the number of companies, cell ag is going from about 6 to 50 plus, plant-based exploding because it's much simpler to do formulations and work with plants rather than tissue culture. It's just extremely high growth rates at the moment. Next, please. So just to sort of get a picture here, this was in 2018, the landscape. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see an explosion of all the different companies supporting the space. Next, please. Cool. So you can see across the landscape, plant-based, cultivated, raw materials, VCs, accelerators, nonprofits. It's a really, really exploding space, and it's a great time to get in. Here are just some mock-ups of what a cellular agriculture site could look like. So if you skip through, this is like big bioreactors. You have your school field trips coming through. You can see the meat coming off the assembly line. It's just one vision. It might not actually look like this, but for this particular mock-up, this is what they really imagined. I think there's one of the robot dogs. Yeah, so if you can skip a couple, please. Yeah, there's a Tesla truck. But alt protein isn't just about food. There's a lot of other places where it comes into play. I mentioned cosmetics. You can also get into leather. So this is actually what I'm working on now. The way that we currently produce leather is we take brewer's spent grain, which props up factory farming. We feed it to a cow. That cow gets slaughtered. We have the raw hides. It goes through a chemically intensive tanning process. And then we get what we call nice leather that goes to make Prada bags, Gucci, shoes, belts, bomber jackets, everything. But if we skip, if you hit the next button, please. If we skip right to the leather factory, we can take 2 kilograms of spent grain and convert it into our new grain leather versus feeding a cow 700 kilograms to get 1 square meter. It's an over 350 times improvement. So next slide, please. The way that spent grain works currently is just very inefficient. The cow's a poor middleman. The thing is, we only need 10% of the world's spent grain in order to satisfy 100% of the demand. London is 600 square miles. The demand for the world's leather is 600 square miles if you were to lay out meter by meter the raw hides. So we only need 10% in order to satisfy our need for this material. There's lots of other materials uses, but I wanted to highlight that it's both biomaterials and food that are encompassed into alternative protein, and we need all the help we can get. So if there's a way that you want to enter the space or have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.